Iris, would you please do the roll call?
Baker,
Here.
Beckett. Here. Fisher.
Here.
Hanson. Here. Heap.
Here.
Hape.
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon Councilor Windland to bring us a council update, please.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you, Chair Baker. The report is fairly short tonight, just a couple of quick highlights from the last City Council meeting. One thing I did want to mention is that we did have a Distinguished Service Award to a couple of our outstanding citizens, and I just bring that to your attention. Willie Poinsettia and Esther Halverson Hill served on the 50 Plus Commission. And it's just another example of great people like yourselves that serve Lake Oswego in a voluntary capacity. They make our city better. And what's really neat is that the work that all of us do as volunteers really makes a difference in many of our community members' lives. And the 50 Plus committee group has done a number of things the last few years, and they wanted to recognize both Willie and Esther for great work that they did. And I think it just serves Lake Oswego very well, and it's a point of great reflection that good, hard, genuine, wonderful work creates wonderful results. And our 50 Plus group in Lake Oswego is certainly growing, and they need all the help that they can get. We did pass Ordinance 2830, which I know that you guys had probably some things to do with it, revising and updating a number of our codes that I won't get into the details, but we had quite a list of different things that were updated to get us kind of up to speed, and that went through very quickly and well. We had a couple of new properties, one on Atwater Road and one on Washington Court, that got annexed into the city following basically the ordinances that we have set up for people to annex themselves into the city. It was derived from homeowners wanting to join the city. We didn't go out and grab them and have them join. They elected to come to the city, and that's basically what we're finding through and through in our experience so far, is those that want to come, they shall come, and those that want to stay unincorporated will stay unincorporated. Then the other big part of our discussion for the council meeting was the actually out of the council meeting and into the redevelopment agency, Laura, was the discussion for the North Anchor project. As you know, the project came to a sudden halt when we had our developer that we worked with for over 5 years drop out of the project. But the city now, with council direction, is going to move towards a similar project and open up the bidding process or the invitation to, we're putting together a request for proposals to the industry and to the public to find out if there's developers who want to do a similar project. There was high agreement from the council that we did want a hotel element, a mid to high-end boutique type hotel, similar to the one that was proposed before, but the other parts of it, of the development, we wanted to keep a little bit more open so that it would entice and maybe have a wider range of people coming in to look at the property, look at the project, and see what could be done with it. One of the advantages that we have from going through the process with the other developer is that we really went through a long process that told us several things about the neighborhood association support, getting kind of the project within the scope of the city, making it economically feasible, figuring out such as underground parking versus above-ground parking, the costs associated, how it would pencil out. So a lot of, while it was a long time to get to this point, I think the city and developers have figured out a lot of different things for the property possibilities. And so I don't feel that we're going to have a very long, if somebody does sign up, which we're hoping they will have a fairly concise time to get the project done. A lot of the heavy lifting has been done already. And we're opening up the process to, I think in November, we're putting to the request for proposal out, and then we hope to have something by January, February to have some sort of selection process started. It's not completely defined yet. The city manager is working on a more finite schedule, but the proposal is to try to get this project fairly quickly put together. And we've had a number of discussions with the city manager and different city councilors and Director Siegel and so on about developers coming in and asking questions and kind of figuring out what possibilities are out there. People are recruiting, city councilors and different people are going out and recruiting people. And there's been, I would say, good interest and credible interest, meaning there weren't people out just fishing. There was people that actually could do a project like this, have done projects like this before, and I think it could be a good possibility to find a good partner to build that North Anchor project. So that's kind of the summation of our last. Nothing major happened, no major decisions, but we did get a lot of work done in the last meeting on nuts and bolts type things, and here we are. Any questions?
Thank you very much. Anybody on the commission have any questions? Dave?
Was any thought given to putting the Parks and Rec building at the North Anchor site since it opened up again, and thus preserving our golf course?
There was no discussion of that at this point. I think the hotel was the primary reason to have in the redevelopment process, one of the main criteria was to get a tax-paying entity on that property. It doesn't mean that we're there. If nobody shows up and nobody decides to build a hotel or go after the project, I think we came to a conclusion that we're going to have to restructure our thoughts and figure out maybe other possibilities. So those things are not off the table at this point, but they're not a primary direction of the council.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great night.
This time on the agenda, we have citizen comment. These comments would be regarding issues not on the agenda. Do we have any blue slips? Now, tonight, we're not using blue slips. As you can tell, we're using the new technology. So if you want to speak to the commission, please fill out your name and address on the computer over there. All right. We have one set of minutes to approve, the September 9th minutes. Are there any, is there any motion to approve the September 9th minutes?
I move. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion of the September 9th minutes? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, please say nay. Motion pass. Next item on the agenda is Commission for the Citizen Involvement, General Updates. I don't know of anybody here who has any updates. Anybody on the commission want to speak to that? All right. We do have several cards for Neighborhood Association.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
We didn't vote on the minutes for September 23rd.
I'm sorry, in one of the emails, they said they
Oh,
weren't
okay.
ready.
Okay.
So that's why I skipped that. Thanks for reminding me. So anyway, we have several reminders of association meetings. One is for Waluga on the 16th. One is for Uplands on the 17th. One is for Palisades on the 17th also. Another is for First Edition Neighborhood and Forest Hills Neighborhood, the emergency preparedness on Thursday, the 17th of October. And the last one is Mountain Park Neighborhood Association on the 29th of October. If you have questions about where they are, interested, I'm sure they're both on the city's website, and we can show these cards to you if you'd like. Anything else from the commissioners on the Commission for Citizen Involvement? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 7, findings, conclusions, and order for the comprehensive plan map and zoning map amendments for properties located at 4403 Kruse Way, LU 17-0070. Did you, Deputy Attorney, do you want to say anything about this?
Not particularly.
Okay, then I'll just read what it says here. It's on the agenda. Public testimony, of course, is not accepted because the hearing's been closed. The commission made a decision, and so we asked the staff to bring back findings and conclusions, and tonight we'll be voting on whether those findings and conclusions meet the criteria that we think is necessary to pass this. On September 9th, we met, made a preliminary recommendation, approved the proposed amendments, and directed staff to return. And they did. Did staff want to say anything about this?
No, thank you, Chair. We believe the draft findings reflect the Commission's deliberation. If you have any questions.
Okay.
The only thing I would add is that this was a quasi-judicial zone change. So Commissioner Pape, you were not at the meeting, so unless you have reviewed the record, you would not be voting.
And was anybody else not at the meeting? Okay. So this is LU 17-0070-1983, and you had the findings and conclusions in front of you. So I would ask the commissioners if there's any questions about the findings and conclusions they want to talk about before we begin the process of voting on it. Seeing none, is there a motion to accept the findings and conclusions as printed?
Well, Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to approve the findings, conclusions, and order for LU 17-0070-1983.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion. It's been made and seconded. Is there any discussion of the motion on the findings and conclusions? All those in favor of the motion to accept, please say aye.
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 Opposed, please say nay. The motion carries. The next item on the agenda is work sessions. Thank you all for attending. And so the first work session is Historic Preservation Community Development Code Amendments, work session number 2 on the LU 18-0009. Public comments will be accepted. And this is about receiving updates, so I guess we could start with the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Baker, members of the commission, I'm just waiting for the screen to pop up here. My name is Paul Espy, and I am from the Long Range Planning Department, and I have with me here this evening Rachel Burdick, who is the Vice Chair of the Historic Resources Advisory Board. And together we are going to go ahead and present what's going on with the Preservation Code. We scheduled a second work session with the Planning Commission to provide a status update on the Historic Preservation Code revisions, and we're looking for additional input on the proposed public outreach and citizen involvement staff needs to do prior to the first formal Planning Commission work session, which is tentatively scheduled for December 9th. For a quick review, and for those of us who haven't been a part of the process, these are the revised code sections proposed by HRAB. Most of the revisions are found under 5006-009 historic preservations. That's really the meat and potatoes of the whole, preservation program. But there are also a lot of other ones that are on this list here that talk about powers and duties, definitions, submittal requirements, and that sort of thing that, those details need to be worked out to clarify the process a little bit better. And then we would perhaps have graphics and plan drawings to be included in a handbook at the second phase of the code revision process. So in general, the goals, we need to achieve consistency with the recent Goal 5 administrative rule revisions, SHPO's model code, and of course, internal consistency with the existing city code. We want to add clarity to the land use procedures for historic preservation applications and those procedures related to HRAB's powers and duties. So 3 primary major policy changes would be demolition by neglect, which is a situation where a property owner intentionally allows a historic property owner a historic property to suffer severe deterioration, potentially beyond the point of repair. And oftentimes people will, or sometimes people will do that as a strategic way by which they can have the building demolished without having to go through any kind of review procedure by the city. We would also like to add in the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation for the treatment of historic properties. That is a nationally recognized set of standards that are added by inference to our code, but we would like to actually fold them into the code language so that it's very clear that those are being applied when alterations, large and small, are being proposed to any historic building. And then finally, HRAB would like to be the primary review authority for major exterior alterations that are not bundled with other larger applications rather than the DRC. They would like to amend the code text to identify HRAB as a review authority for exterior alterations because they feel, and I would agree, that they have a greater expertise in reviewing exterior alterations of those buildings. So just to let you know, we're here, I provided this graphic. The work sessions with the Historic Resources Advisory Board are complete, and the revised code sections are now being reviewed by the city attorney and staff. A draft of the code revisions will be sent to the State Historic Preservation Office for, so that they can review for consistency with their model code language. And then a notice to the owners of historic properties, including those properties on the National Register but not on the LDL, will also be sent to let them know. I think we want to send a special noticing to them preliminarily before the standard land use noticing, just to let them know and give them a heads up and give them an opportunity to digest what's going on with the preservation code revisions. And then a public review draft containing the proposed revisions will be distributed prior to the Planning Commission work session on December 9th. And then subsequent Planning Commission and City Council hearings will be held throughout this next spring. So the information related to the project, including copies of the staff report and draft code revisions, are located on the city website under the corresponding project file, and anyone interested in receiving additional information can obtain it from the website. Again, as I stated earlier, the preliminary notice containing information about the code revisions will be sent to property owners, and then we will send a press release letting the city at large know in an informal way before we send out the formal land use noticing. And then staff will issue the public review draft and hold a work session with the planning commission. So this is just a graphic that summarizes all of the steps that are going to occur with the review. And I am open for any questions.
Commissioner Ward?
We are.
My thing's not working. Why is it not working?
I think that there's something that's implied but not stated on page 3 under D. ADJOURNMENT is a review authority for exterior alterations instead of development review commission. And I think what you're talking about, I hope it is that ADJOURNMENT is to be the authority for exterior alterations of historic buildings.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
And then we have some discussion about whether or not those alterations are going to be bundled. Sometimes we have those bundled with a major development application that would be normally reviewed by DRC. And in that case, the DRC would likely review those if the alteration proposal was a subordinate part of that application. But if it's just a minor or major alteration, it would go to ADJOURNMENT.
And then so are you saying then you'd slice and dice it between DRC and HRAB?
Only when applications are before ADJOURNMENT that don't involve anything that the DRC would normally review.
That does or does not involve what DRC would review?
Correct. So if there's an application that DRC normally reviews, like a subdivision or something like that, and it has a component for an alteration, like there's a historic building on the lot that's being subdivided, it would go to DRC. But if it's just the house that's being altered, then it would go to ADJOURNMENT.
Or if it were a commercial building that was being altered in some fashion, are we going to be looking to HRAB for review of that also, if it's a historic building?
For the exterior alterations, correct, yes.
Okay. The next question I have, under E on the same page, it talks about potential historic significance. That sounds like it's pretty subjective. So we've got a building that's more than 50 years old and somebody says it's of historical significance. How is that decision to be made?
There are quite a few buildings in our city that are older than 50 years old, but are no longer viable in terms of historic preservation because they've been already altered, or there's too many things that have happened to them that no longer qualify. ADJOURNMENT looks at 3 different categories when they are determining whether or not a building is historic. Not only do they look at whether or not it's 50 years old, but you would also look at the architectural significance to see if all of the original, and you compare that with older photographs and the history of the building to see if the building is still consistent with the way it was originally built. And if it is, then that's one aspect. We also look at the historic significance to determine whether or not a structure is historic. If something historically significant happened on the site, and perhaps maybe the building isn't so great, but maybe something very important happened on that site, there would be some consideration for that as well.
So there'll be some sort of case-by-case subjective review to determine whether there is indeed historic significance to a particular structure?
Well, I don't know if it is subjective per se, but I would say that they do look at the architectural, historic, and environmental significance of a site to determine whether or not it is historic.
Okay, thank you.
This, if I may add, I mean, this topic is a policy issue that the city's looking at through a few different lenses. One is that the city council has directed that the city adopt a demolition tax. So that would be a tax on mechanical removal of any home. They've also indicated that they would like to encourage deconstruction, manual deconstruction as an alternative to demolition. And so in adopting a tax, they may consider a credit or a discount on the demolition tax for deconstruction. This is saying something somewhat different in that it's saying that the ATRAB is considering requiring deconstruction of structures that are 50 years or older. I think under the state housing rules, we would have to have clear and objective standards for development or redevelopment of housing. That can be done, but it's just a process for defining, what, is it just by virtue of age? Is it by virtue of age and some other documented attribute of the property? So these are all questions that ATRAB is going to be studying, and I think will be coming forward in some form of an ordinance proposal, but we will be looking at this through that kind of higher level policy objective that the city council has set as well. This is not fully formed yet, and I think with the planning commission's concurrence, it would be helpful direction to ATRAB going forward if this is something that we should be looking at. So.
Thank you. Commissioner Fisher.
Yeah, I'm hearing your explanations, and it's getting more confusion in my mind. I saw somewhere, and I can't point to it right now, where it said non-historic properties over 50 years will be subject to a deconstruction tax or a reconstruction tax. Is that?
Well, the deconstruct or the demolition tax that is being considered by the city council, it's not part of the development code. It's not a land use requirement. The proposal or the thought of encouraging deconstruction as an alternative to mechanical removal, it would come in as a financial incentive. And so there's no proposal at this point before this body or being considered by the city council that would require deconstruction. It would only be encouraged through incentives. Does that answer your question, Commissioner?
Yes and no.
Other questions?
Yeah, I know it's a policy issue, and so I'm hesitant to ask, but how does that intertwine with Senate Bill 2001? The Law 2001, in which, let's say I'm a builder and I want to buy a 51-year-old house. I'm going to be paying a tax if I want to create a duplex, for example. But you can't stop me from creating a duplex. And if I do it if I buy a 49-year-old house, I don't have to pay that tax.
Oh, maybe that's where we're not meeting each other in the middle here on the communication. The demolition tax would apply to any home, at least as it's been conceived so far. Now, that could change when it comes before council. It's really any home. And the policy objective there was to try to encourage the retention of existing housing stock, and it's also being looked at as a means of raising revenue for other city infrastructure projects.
Commissioner Heat.
Yes, Planner Espy, I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit on the public outreach process. You mentioned that homeowners, historic owners of homes would be notified. But my question is, what about developers in our community that have redeveloped historic homes? Is there any plans for feedback from those developers? My concern would be that maybe some of the developers may feel that some of the standards may be too strict, too onerous. And so how do we get that feedback so that, we feel like we've really heard from developers on this?
Well, number one, the Home Builders Association has identified an interest in looking at this process, so I was going to use them as a clearinghouse for the information that we review by either providing them the information physically or directing them to the city website where it will be located, digitally. And then it would be difficult to identify every single member of the home building community, so perhaps, some of our, notice to some of our frequent flyers are people that are usually working with us in our process to send them notice as well of this.
Thank you. I think those are all good ideas, and I'd be very interested in hearing their feedback.
Okay, sounds good.
Commissioner Beckett?
Yes, I'm curious about demolition by neglect. How do you set the criteria? When is it determined that it's in? What do you do to protect against it? Is that tied in with the demolition tax at all?
I don't believe that it's tied in with the demolition tax, but we have been researching other jurisdictions as to how to approach demolition by neglect. It's primarily dealt with through the building code, and those that, if we do identify a building, or if the city identifies a building that has been neglected to a point where it needs to be demolished, or it's about to be demolished, or, in some other place, we would need to notify the property owner that they need to rehabilitate the house to the point where it's no longer, at the precipice of being demolished. And there could either be an incentive program for them to do this by providing a preservation grant, or there is a mechanism that we have proposed in the code to put a lien on the property. And so there would be, that lien would hold on the property until the property owner performed or rehabilitated.
Perhaps
property to
it
the
could be
city.
tied in with the demolition tax, maybe years before it reached that critical point of having to be deconstructed. You started applying a demolition tax. In other words, you're going to have to pay so much per year until you restore this building. That would be an incentive for them to get in gear and get it done.
I think that's a good idea. We can probably take a look at that and add that in.
Chair, just to remind everyone, because if I don't, Evan will, that what they're looking at combines land use regulation and non-land use regulation, like we were talking about building codes, and a requirement that would prevent or discourage demolition by neglect if that was a building code standard, or it might be in the nuisance code. It could be in any number of places. It wouldn't be a land use regulation. Financial incentives like grants would, not something that the Planning Commission would be advising the council on. ATRAB, in ATRAB's capacity as the advisory body to council on historic preservation, is really in the lead on that. So there is somewhat of a division of labor that we need to figure out here. And I think tonight, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, we're really looking for some guidance on the public process and how the commission, as the Commission for Citizen Involvement, would like ATRAB and staff to engage the community. And it was already suggested by Commissioner Heap that we engage the Home Builders Association and any other recommendations that you have along those lines. Now, the preservation code that is also part of this is in the Community Development Code. It is a set of land use regulations. And so when Paul was discussing the delegation of authority to review alterations between DRC and ATRAB, that is a sort of a land use policy issue that the Planning Commission eventually will weigh in on as this proposal comes up to you. So I try not to overcomplicate it, but there is a division of labor here. And if you can think about financial and non-land use regulations over here with ATRAB and the council, and then land use regulations, Community Development Code procedures over here with the Planning Commission and ATRAB advising council. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you very much. Commissioner Pape, please.
So, Director Siegel, if I'm, as you just defined the two buckets, if I'm not in the correct bucket, stop me.
Okay.
Okay. I'm still stuck on E, and the potential historic significance. As Commissioner Ward mentioned, that is extreme, in my opinion, that is very, very, a head nod.
Well, to be listed as a designated landmark, it's
Right.
not just, I want to be on it, and you're, there's actually criteria that we look at, and they have to meet it. So it's just not a house that's 50 years old, it's 50 years old and has significance.
Right.
So and there's a list of criteria to be, and to be similar to what if you were to be, let's say I'm a homeowner, I say I would like my house to be listed, I have to prove that, it's historically significant. And again, is it architecturally significant? Was it built by a prominent architect? Is it maybe the only architectural style in our city? Did something of major historic significance happen there? It's just not a random.
Right, and that's what I'm trying to get to.
So
What
there's-
is that, what is that potential historical significance? Is it planting a tree 51 years ago and it's the only one left in the neighborhood?
No, it would be a house that's potentially built by a prominent local architect.
And so these examples are where this criteria is spelled out specifically, and you hold to those
Yes.
guidelines.
And we use that already when we, just to
So a
approve a
prominent artist who
designation.
created a piece of art in that building.
It would depend how, again, we need to go and look at the criteria and say it can't just be any artist. And
Okay.
is it someone that says, oh, I'm an artist, or is it someone who's had impact on the community and that the community, most of the community at large would say, we recognize that artist.
Okay.
We recognize, so it's not like I can say, oh, well, I really like Sally and I think she's a great artist and she's made these things and this house is over 50 years old, so I think that's historically significant. There's more to it. It has to hold. And we have some homeowners that have come to us and said, we want our house to be listed, and we've looked at it and said, it just doesn't hold weight. It's maybe architecturally had too many changes to it, and if it didn't have the modifications, it might have been significant. And we've had to say it's not significant. So it's not just I want it on there or I like it. There are criteria, and I think we'd be using those same criteria that we already use. And again, it's not a willy-nilly process, I guess you could say.
Oh, and I don't believe that your process is necessarily willy-nilly, but not having it clearly defined so that everybody understands what potentials and
We do
historical
list out
significance
what
is.
it means.
That's where.
So it does,
that is
and it's actually quite similar to when you would, and it's not exact because it's not a national register, but when you want to be, if a property wants to be on the national register, it lays out very specific
Oh, yeah.
criteria. And ours is very much in that same, it's very similar to that. Again, we're at a local level, not a national level, so, you're looking
And then
at
you also
things.
pointed to homeowners or people that own the property coming to you to have their property, their building registered, identified.
Right now, that's how often buildings come to us to be put as locally.
It's not in the reverse.
But you can't have others come and say, we think this house is significant, and then the house may be looked at. But again, it has to meet
But if
criteria.
the homeowner doesn't want it to be,
It can,
So the same criteria
it's out of the
that's used
homeowner's
to-
hands then, correct?
The same criteria that's used to designate the building would be used to remove it from the list if a homeowner had requested that.
The same,
So does everybody understand how a building gets on the historic register? It isn't something that the city decides, is it? The city agrees to it.
The application
the
is initiated
applicant-
by the property owner.
By the property owner. But once you're on it, then there's a process of getting off of it.
Correct.
But we don't just involuntarily go around and say, that property looks like it's historic, we're going to make it historic without the permission from the owner.
perfect.
And if I may add, I think the distinction here is under E, where it talks about demolition review of undesignated buildings. This is conceding, I think, that we have a building that's going to be removed, either demolished or deconstructed, and HRAB is recommending that there be some documentation of that if the building is 50 years or older. It's not requiring that the building be designated at that point. It's saying that there may be some history here that is worth preserving. And I think there is a sort of a clear path and an objective way to get there and to do this, if that's what you ultimately decide to adopt.
Thank
Whether it's
you.
in the building code or the land use code, that's an
Gotcha.
open question.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ward.
Regarding public outreach, I have a thought, which I think I've mentioned before in the past, to reach out to the public, and this would apply to our next item on the list also, it seems to me that it would be really easy for a small blur, a small couple of 3 sentences to be placed in a hello LO regarding HRAB's activities and on the next subject, Commission for Citizen Involvement. You know, those papers go out to many, many people throughout the city periodically at no cost to the subscribers, if you will, to the recipients of them. It seems like a wonderful way to inform citizens of the activities of the various commissions and boards in the city. And instead of just having a list of, you know, the date that there'll be a HRAB meeting, if there could be a short article, it doesn't need to be a great long expository presentation, just that HRAB will meet on such and such a date at such and such a place to discuss the subject. I think that could be very easily accomplished, and I think it would be very informative to many, many of the citizens of our town. And we have the information staff here in the city that puts Hello LO together, and all we need to do is give them a heads up.
We do dedicate the entire insert to, the Hello LO insert to Preservation Month each year. And we give them a fairly significant amount of information during that time in terms of, you know, what it means to have a historic property, the programs that are going on around town, all sorts of things. And then throughout the year as well, there's quite a bit. And all 3 of the preservation organizations in the city, Historic Resources Advisory Board, the Lake Oswego Preservation Society, and the Heritage Council.
I'm just asking for a little win with every edition of Hello LO. And I would like for the subject matter of the Planning Commission to be included in those little notices as to what we're up to, you know, just a super brief summary of this, for instance, with our group. I think it would be a really simple way to reach out to the public.
That sounds great.
Thank you. I noticed when I was looking up here that I don't have a yellow button, so I guess I get to insert myself most any time I want, right?
You can just,
So,
you're the boss.
yeah, well, I don't know about that, but yeah, thanks. One thing came up in my mind when we were talking earlier was, how do we arrive at the 50-year standard? Is that a national standard, or is it, okay,
It is, yes.
okay. Just, that was my only question of everything else we talked about. Any other questions from the commission on this subject? Seeing none, thank you very much for your report.
Thank you.
And I hope we gave you some information to help. Next item on the agenda is 8.2, Planning Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement Goals for 2019. Work session number 1. The public can comment on this. You're limited to 5 minutes, please, per individual. And let's start with a staff report. Did you want to give one on that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Baker, members of the Planning Commission. Just a few very brief comments, and then Eric and I, Senior Planner Olson and I will be available to answer questions and help facilitate the discussion. This is your first work session for goal setting for the year 2020, and we're following the same model that we've followed in years past. That is open to kind of redirection or changes as you may like to see. We begin by reviewing the goals that you had set this year, the beginning of this year, and the memo that we provided goes over that. So I'm not going to review every goal or every accomplishment, but you may have observed that you did do a lot of work last year, and some of the highlights are included there, including short-term rental regulations and updating the Community Development Code, the annual CDC amendments, a number of other tasks that we're still working on, including implementation of the citizen involvement guideline updates that were identified last year. So there is quite a bit of work that's ongoing, and we're reaching milestones on several of these projects, but a number of them will carry over into next year. And the staff report highlights that. On page 5 of the report, we've identified potential goals for next year, beginning with the work that's underway. And that includes updating our housing code, or, excuse me, our land use regulations for needed housing in the city. And as you may recall, our work on that was put on hold earlier in the year when the City Council and the Planning Commission met to discuss the work in progress on incentives for affordable housing. The council direction at that time was to defer the discussion and the policy work until the legislature had adjourned and the outcome on House Bill 2001 and other bills was known. And we now know the outcome of the bill, and the commission and council have a joint meeting scheduled in December where we're going to take that up. But just a reminder, that housing goal began, excuse me, with the City Council's direction a couple of years ago, which was to look at facilitating needed housing, more economical housing, and so we've been working away at that. The Planning Commission reviewed changes to the Community Development Code that were ultimately approved by City Council, streamlining the permit process for accessory dwelling units. The City Council has also adopted financial incentives for more economical housing, including ADUs, and multifamily or affordable multifamily housing. The next task on the list was to look at land use incentives or code adjustments that the city might want to make available for below market rate housing or affordable housing that's meeting a targeted income category in the community. So that's where we left off. We're anticipating a good discussion this fall with the City Council on that. And then moving forward, we'll have a work program that we're developing with you and the council going out into 2020. So generally what that looks like is that the cities are not moving ahead at this point very rapidly unless they had already had middle housing on their agendas. We're really waiting for some sign from the state or some direction on what the rulemaking will say. So the way that this process works is that the legislature, approves a bill, it's signed by the governor, it goes into effect. With House Bill 2001, there were basically 3 components to that. The changes to accessory dwelling unit requirements went into effect upon the effective date of the statute. So the 2 changes that really forced on the city were, one, that we're no longer able to require additional parking for ADUs, and secondly, we're not to require any tenant or owner occupancy status of ADUs. So fairly straightforward in terms of our code. Those 2 requirements are they're part of the annual CDC amendments that are coming forward for a public hearing with the Planning Commission next month, and then that'll be dealt with. Until the code's amended, we're enforcing the new requirements and the preemption in the state law on ADUs. The other components of House Bill 2001 have a delayed requirement for the city. One has to do with duplexes, and so we'll be working with the commission and ultimately the community to respond to the legislation, which requires a duplex be allowed on every lot that is zoned to allow detached single-family homes. So you think about it, that could be very extensive, but we also need to look at what the bill permits us to do in the way of protecting the public health and safety and making sure that we have development standards that are in the public interest. So that's the second component, having to do with duplexes. The third component is middle housing. Middle housing also includes duplexes, but the sort of the bulk of the middle housing is for triplexes, so 3 units in a building on a lot, or 4plexes, self-explanatory, or cottage cluster development and attached townhomes. Cottage cluster is a form of multifamily housing, although the units are detached, and it may be that you have what would otherwise appear to be 4 or more single-family homes that are smaller, that are more cottage in size and scale, that are all located on the same lot and that are master planned around a common open space area. They have circulation and parking that's really well thought out, and that's really the concept of cottage cluster. So middle housing, triplex, fourplex, cottage cluster, and then duplex is also in there, but it has its own requirement for single-family lots. Middle housing, the city, according to the statute, must not preclude middle housing, all types of middle housing in all areas of the city that are currently zoned for detached single-family housing. So that doesn't say that all types of missing middle housing must be allowed on every lot that is zoned for detached single-family homes. It's specific to areas of the city where this type of housing is allowed. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time with the commission and with the council and ultimately the community, really trying to drill down in terms of what that means for this community and what types of what are called siting and design regulations or site planning and building design regulations we'll ultimately want to adopt to manage that. So that's a lot of work, and it's anticipated that the state will be promulgating rules in the beginning of 2020, and then in the second half of 2020, the administrative rules that implement the statute will be adopted, and the state Department of Land Conservation and Development will be preparing a model ordinance that goes along with the rules, that we will have the choice of either adopting the model ordinance or getting ahead of that process and developing our own standards, which I would strongly recommend. And when we meet with the council, we'll discuss that. And in addition to develop, if we were to be in the driver's seat on that, how might we be engaged with the state as they're developing their rules, and how do we participate at that level to make sure that the city's interests are known, and that ultimately the model ordinances and the rules that they develop are workable, and that local jurisdictions can actually implement them. So that's, and I may have taken Eric's thunder, but that's really the main objective for the next second half of next year, and we'll be working on that into the following year, I'm sure, because the deadline for adopting local ordinances or defaulting to the state model is June of 2022. So that's one. It's not just a potential goal, it's actually a goal to deal with that.
Could we ask you a question?
We'll pause there and we'll take questions.
Yeah.
I just have a quick question, if you could help me understand how attached townhomes apply to single-family, what have been single-family residential lots. How could we hypothetically put 4 of those guys side by side on a single-family lot?
You want to talk about the?
In my experience, townhomes are, typically have their own, or often have their own tax lots, so I'm not sure it would be as applicable in those. It's typically a 0 lot line dwelling, as we would refer to it, so it might not address the requirements to allow that middle housing on a, per lot basis necessarily, I guess.
So we don't really know yet.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I, conceive of townhomes, it doesn't seem like it would apply directly to townhomes necessarily. Because again, it's sort of a 1 lot per unit with a, 0 lot line structure.
Well, in my understanding, townhomes are typically homes that have 2 or maybe more stories and therefore rather narrow, typically. And so we're stacking them kind of a row of vertically aligned residences.
Right, so I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that those residences, even because they're vertical, are typically on their own individual tax lots. So if you're talking about, a duplex where there's 2, there's 2 units in a structure, then that's sort of a different concept than just having a 0 lot line, really not having any setbacks with your neighbor, which is sort of
Okay,
typical
well,
of that townhouse.
that's not really helpful to my understanding. Does Measure 2001 allow some maximum number of attached townhomes on what have been single-family residential lots?
Not to my understanding, no.
Okay.
Any other questions? Commissioner Beckett?
There are, of course, 22 neighborhood associations in town.
Most of those have single-family residents, but there are at least 8 or more homeowners associations, which is a very different animal. The homeowners associations have a long history of having carved out their density. Is there any allowance made if the density within a homeowners association is up to some level that excuses them from having to proceed further, but can just rest on the work that they've done for the last few decades?
Yeah, there is a carve-out or an exception in the legislation for pre-existing or homeowners association covenants and other private restrictions that predated the effective date of the statute. There is a preemption now on such rules going forward, and that if we review if the DRC reviews a planned unit development application and the applicant is proposing that city, they may be in violation of that statute. City wouldn't be, but they may be.
Any
We're
other
gonna have a lot-
questions?
We're gonna have a lot of opportunity to drill down into the weeds on
I
this.
know this 2001 is going to get
Many
worked a
policy
lot.
issues, yeah.
No other questions? Any more staff report?
Well, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that, just so you're aware of what's coming, and that it looks like it's just one goal, but there are a number of tasks and due diligence and participation at the state level, as well as community planning that we'll want to do here to work through this on housing. The next goal on citizen involvement guidelines, we're just proposing to continue the work on that, I think, unless you have any questions or if Eric has anything to add. We'd like to see that completed, as I'm sure you would next year.
Just a reminder that we do have another work session upcoming later this month on the 24th.
Okay.
And we're holding another focus group actually later this week.
Okay. And then the only other existing or ongoing items, you've heard about historic preservation code updates this evening. Number 4 is the R6 zone and some amendments to the first edition neighborhood standards that you had received a briefing on earlier this year, and then staff working with the neighborhood association, I think, decided that it would be best to put those code amendments on their own track because of the geographic area and the process, or the public process that we want to work through on that.
So we have a question on
Yeah.
that, don't we? Commissioner Heap?
Or actually, my question was, I was going to hold off to the end, just to ask about the process. So maybe I can defer my question until Director Siegel's finished.
Okay, I'll finish really quickly here. So the last item that is ongoing is amending the traffic management requirements for the Kruse corridor. Then there's some potential new work they've identified under climate change and climate resiliency that is worth some discussion.
Okay, now we're finished. Commissioner Heap?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, so my question was, what are the process that will be following? It looks like this is our initial proposed list of goals. And so for commissioners that want to maybe submit goals, what's the process and the timeline that will follow to maybe submit proposals for goals?
And thank you for asking, but I'll defer to the director, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So that's a good point. We have the chair solicited proposed goals or ideas from the commission in the past. And so the way the process is lined out here, I would see that coming in, Commissioner Heap, following this meeting this evening and before the city goes out for public input. So one option would be that the commission accepts any goals that commissioners individually want to bring in to the public vetting. Another option would be that the commission meets to go over that list of goals before we put it out for public review, in which case we would want to add this to your October 28th meeting agenda, and we can do that. And then the public review on the draft goals would then follow that meeting. So there are a couple of ways to approach that, and we're open to however you want to solicit goals from your group.
And I think in the past, it's been pretty successful that each commissioner just turns in what they would like to see, any additional goals listed, and just email it to myself and the director. and then we'll get a discussion on it at the next meeting for a few minutes.
At the next meeting, before we go up for public review then, is that your thought, Chair?
Yes?
If that's-
Does that work for the rest of you?
Yes.
Good. Okay, I think we have a consent there.
Mr. Chair, maybe one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
I noticed one thing that's not on our list that's towards our end of our meeting forecast is the small cell telecom equipment. Is that expected that it will carry over? Because we're starting, looks like work on it at the beginning of December, and will that carry over to next year?
Yeah, that's a good catch, and we should note that that is likely to be a work program item next year. I don't know if it's a goal, but it's something that, it is something that this, you have some discretion in recommending, the priorities for city council, and that the small cell proposals that we're seeing and that we're likely to see in the near term are on public property. They're in the public right-of-way, and we already have an ordinance and standards in place for that. So this ordinance would apply to private property. It would be if someone, telecom company was wanting to locate an antenna on a building or on a vacant lot someplace, or in a public open space.
Thank you.
So is this listed as an item of staff proposal and council proposal, or is this a goal?
I think it's work that we know that that we need to do. And the timing is open to discussion with the council, and I think it would be worth discussing with the council.
Oh, I agree. I
Yeah.
just was curious of the source.
It's not, well, the source is staff.
Okay.
And it follows the work that the city did earlier on the public right-of-way ordinance.
Good. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions about this staff report or about this process? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Oh, I'm sorry.
Is there any
I
public
beg your pardon. I
comment?
have one citizen who would like to speak to us. Michael Buck. Michael Buck.
And Chair,
Thank
before I forget, I did want to mention that our fire marshal, Eric Zutendijk, is here. And we've been working together on this concept of climate resiliency and looking at wildland fire interface. So if you had questions about what that might entail or where we were coming from with that, we're happy, together to answer questions about it.
Good, because I do.
Okay.
Good. Chair Baker and Commissioners, good evening. My name is Michael Buck. I reside at 3155 Edgemont Road. I am here on behalf of President Ken Sandblast and the Lake Grove Business Association, and we loathe to bring anything more to your plate. But one goal we would like you to see, and we think it's very opportune time with the Boones Ferry Road project and with a lot of development going on in Lake Grove, is to look at the development overlay design code for both West Lake Grove and Lake Grove. And the older I get in life, I discern between the pains I need to live with and the pains that I can actually, for God's sake, let go of. And so this is one of the things I think we can try to improve and let go of. I think it's a request that's got merit. It comes from a lot of business people and stakeholders that have dealt in these pre-application conferences, and it just seems like a lot of calisthenics with a lot of compliance-driven overlay details that can be simplified in unified. So we're seeking some consistency, some just good design performance objectives, and maybe a little. And I just want to say this is our first public outreach, so I don't want to get into too many details because I think it demands more analysis and a lot of more input from all different kinds of business and neighborhood stakeholders. But, if you've attended any of these kind of development planning sessions, to being wedded to all these different kinds of architectural codes rather than looking at the end product, of real permanency and good materials and up-to-date contemporary materials. These things are antiquated, outmoded, so we need to bring them into contemporary but also the future outlook. Even the example I put in the sheet that you got, in Lake Grove right now, even around the Bryant, Boones Ferry Road intersection, if you go to West Lake Grove and Lake Grove, we have 3 different kinds of streetlights prescribed. And I know development occurred over time because it was manageable. We had the Lake Grove plan that went to Madrona, to Reese and beyond to Lanewood and almost to Mercantile. And then West Lake Grove was its own entity. But I think most people in our town see Lake Grove as one entity that shares somewhat same characteristics, the same goals, same objectives. West Lake Grove is a transition area, but Lake Grove has transition areas in its own overlay, and it can be easily adapted. So we're looking to have you see this as a worthwhile goal. I think it would help city staff and really help in future development, moving toward a uniformity and a simplicity of one code overlay rather than 2 for Lake Grove.
Commissioner Beckett?
I would say amen. I was
Yep.
so glad to see your notice about that. It's been so confusing to me to say, why 2 different Lake Groves? What Lake Grove versus
Button.
West Lake Grove? Let's make it one unit.
Could you press your red button, please? Thanks. Couldn't quite hear you.
I was saying amen. I've been puzzled for a long time as to why we have Lake Grove and West Lake Grove. Let's make it one unit. Perhaps you can get a committee between the 2 neighborhoods and begin to smooth that out and propose it to the commission.
Thank you. We totally agree.
Thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner Heap?
Just a point of clarification, I thought you may have mentioned that you were looking at the 2 overlays to be unified, but not necessarily separate. And then as we just heard now, I think what you were saying is that you're looking for a single overlay, not maybe 2 overlays.
That's what we'd like to explore.
Okay, a
Having
single
them come
overlay.
together, and we're not talking about zoning, or, setbacks or buffering or any of that. It's just on the design elements and styles as pertain to the property and the right-of-way. So, it's I guess a narrower focus. We're not throwing open the whole thing there.
And maybe one more question is, you mentioned this is something that's being driven by the Lake Grove Business Association. Has the neighborhoods provided any feedback and interest on this, the neighborhood associations?
No, but I'm sure they would. I think our first step was coming to see if we had an avenue for collaboration, whether this is a goal that you see as, being meritorious, and then we'd go with further outreach.
I certainly would like to hear from the neighborhood associations before pushing it forward as a goal.
Thank you.
And Commissioner Ward, please.
I have been on the record as being no fan of the West Lake Grove zoning. It's a little tiny area with, I think, 3 different zones, and some of them are about the size of a residential building lot. That is not my idea of good zoning, good planning. What I think you're proposing, Mr. Buck, has to do with building design, if I'm not mistaken. And I always think that simplifying regulations in a fashion that is beneficial to all throughout the community is a great idea, and I like what you're talking about. So thanks for bringing that to us.
Thank you. If I could say one thing in response, Commissioner Ward, this is a time to look at different things, especially even environmental things that I think we want. So like the buffered area in the back, the overlay is so outdated. This would be a good time to say, where do we want, the appropriate tree, whether it's native or not? And really define the areas and prescribe, how do we get back to the character we want, that's mentioned, but we don't always, put it in. Even Westlake Grove has, street trees have to be in a row. Well, how can we leave natural trees or native trees if they all have to be in a row? So I think there are some things we can actually look at, in terms of just the environment that would be a help too, that I think both business and neighbors would agree on. So it's just an opportunity and a possibility.
Yes, I agree. That is well worth looking into further and try to go in a direction that looks to the future and doesn't lock everyone into the current planning, which I think is kind of a little bit hodgepodge and needs to be more unified, as you point out. So thank you.
Commissioner Fisher?
I absolutely agree with what Commissioner Ward said. My only concern is, why do we have it? There must have been a reason why we have these things.
Well, we agree that we still need the overlays, because overlays integrate unique characteristics of certain areas. And I think most people would say Lake Row has definite personality and character, where we emphasize different things. So we want to keep the overlay, we just want to make it more workable. And so that's our objective. And not be wedded. Well, I think I have to see what comes out of it. I don't want to give the end product, but I just would like to have the goal set to work on it. I have my own ideas, but
So then I guess it's up to one of the commissioners or more to put that on their list for our next meeting.
Good.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, then I think we're finished with this. And moving, Commissioner Heap.
Were we going to talk with, maybe ask questions on the goals for the fire department and the risk?
In this session, or are we just going to simply ask him to update us? I think
Well,
that's what I understood.
This is really just an opportunity to ask questions about the intent. If it's not clear, we're happy to discuss it. I mean, the background is that the fire department obviously has a charge to protect life and property, and we're looking at climate change, and so we're also looking at climate resiliency, and where those two cross over, whether it's building standards or landscaping or property maintenance, and some of which is inside the Planning Commission scope and some of is outside. The thought was that the work that the city has done up to this point on climate action planning doesn't address these other resiliency issues. And so that's where we were thinking that it would be worth exploring, whether these other issues like wildfire hazard. We are looking at other natural hazards. The state's coming out with some new guidance on geologic hazards and landslides. So planning and engineering are going to be working on that. It's possible that there may be some policy or code changes that come from that, if not next year and the years that follow. So this comes up on the radar because of recent events in the West and across the country, and just wanting to be proactive where we can.
Did you want to say more?
Yeah, I guess I did have a question. It's just about the scope. So it specifically calls out review the wildfire risk. But one of the thoughts first of all, I think this is an excellent goal, and I think we should consider it. But I'm just wondering if it shouldn't be a little bit broader, or is it envisioned to be a little bit broader? And that one of the concerns I have had that I'm a little bit puzzled why we as a community aren't doing more is related to earthquakes and the fire danger that earthquakes. So, gas automatic shutoffs, maybe requiring developments to have the gas shutoff tools, by the mains, those type of issues related to earthquakes. Would that be part of this, or would that be outside of it?
Well, a lot of that would be really outside. It would be building code, and the state first needs to catch up and, get ahead in areas that you're describing. It's not something that we can do, but I don't know if the fire marshal would have anything to add. Certainly, the city can and does encourage emergency preparedness and has an emergency preparedness plan and a coordinated approach for responding to incidents. We also have the community emergency response teams and training that the fire department and others do routinely. So were there other thoughts along those lines that you want?
No, I think you answered it, Director Siegel. I think it might be outside of the scope of this commission, but something I encourage as a community to look at, and maybe at a state level too, whatever we can do.
So should we just ask the fire marshal to go ahead and speak for a couple of minutes since he's here tonight? Or if you want to, it's up to you.
I can't, if you have questions, I'm not shy.
Good.
So, yeah, I would say if you have any questions, I don't have anything
Well,
really to add.
I in particular have one personal question, because I live in an area right next to a large forested area, Tryon Creek, and I've always been interested in how to react to wildfires in the forest. I'm only 50 feet away from the forest, so is that a high-risk environment for those who live that close to the forest?
Well, it always is. You know, if we look at history, you know, we've had some very major fires in Oregon on the west side. You know, the biggest thing that we always recommend is looking at what you can do on your property and making a buffer. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you cut down all the trees and pave everything, but there's a lot of ways you can mitigate the fire travel by selecting better plants that are fire resistive, you know, getting rid of blackberries and the lower fuels. So the lower fuels are the ones that dry out real quick and move the fastest. So if you have fuels that are not lateral, so they don't climb up the trees and are all dried out, the fire normally doesn't spread up and then go in the crowns. So there's a lot of things that can be done. Especially, you know, the city has worked with the Parks Department on city parks to create a buffer and pull ivy and get rid of some of this vegetation that is not conducive to fire and spreads it too fast, so.
So do you see this commission developing some development rules that would help reduce the threat of wildfires to those homes?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunities. You know, I think recommendations on what type of trees, some hardening of homes that's currently in the residential code but not adopted in Oregon, where you provide some other means of building construction that wouldn't add that much cost to it when you build a new home. One example is like the bird blocking of the vents in the attics, making it so it's a little bit smaller in size. It helps that the embers don't go in. So just as simple as that. Looking at the roof itself, looking what kind of materials. So there's things that can be done.
So those are more code items for building as opposed to land development that I hear you talking about.
Yeah, and so just to tag on to that, this is where we need to work together.
Yeah.
So if fire department, along with our building officials, identifying best practices, then we look at our zoning and development regulations, see, are they working in sync? Are they working at cross purposes? How can we make it more feasible to have, you know, the roof treatment or the hardening of the structure? And I think there is a role for planning, but more the non-regulatory planning, the assistance that we provide to neighborhood associations through grants and outreach and education on doing the sorts of things that the fire marshal's talking about with property maintenance and, again, not clearing trees necessarily, but planting the right tree in the right place and thinking about trees and materials that are not as combustible as some that are out there.
Good. So I think there's room to put this as a goal. Commissioner Ward?
Thank you for coming to our meeting tonight.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me if there's a list of relatively fire-resistant plants and/or a list of relatively fire-prone plants?
Actually, there is. Yeah, OSU, the Extension Office has actually a booklet.
The Extension Services will have
yeah.
it.
Yep.
Okay,
So yes, there is.
thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming and talking to us
Absolutely.
tonight.
Thank you for allowing
Hopefully,
me to
we'll
talk.
get this on our goal list.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Eric.
Any other comments or goals? Okay, I think we're down to other business. Any other business? Have none. schedule review. Director, would you like to lead us in this?
I would love to, but I don't even have it in front of me. Thank you.
I had to get mine too.
Yeah. So your next meeting, October 28th, we'll come back on this, on the goals, the goal setting. So I'll send out a request to the commissioners asking for your feedback on goals. And then on October 28th, we'll plan on having a continued discussion on that. You also have the third work session on citizen involvement guidelines. And Eric, anything there to point out or just informational?
We'll just be continuing our discussion, giving you a bit of an update about the focus groups that have been held thus far, which Commissioner Pape has been attending, both of the ones that have happened so far. So we'll be holding a combined focus group later this week to discuss some of those more refined recommendations. It might not be feasible to talk too much about the results of those conversations, but I'll give you as much of an update as I can. Get the staff report in time for the meeting at least. But it's all fairly dynamic, so it'll just be kind of a check-in.
November 13th, you have a public hearing on the annual Community Development Code amendments. And that will following that, you have a work session on the R6 zone, the first edition neighborhood code amendments. Then completing the year will be, well, tentatively a work session on the small cell standards for that are not in the public right-of-way. And that concludes the year. We are tracking a few other potential projects that were not discussed in the goal setting because the time and schedule are really uncertain at this point, one of which is, excuse me, urban services boundary amendment. The Parks Department may be proposing an amendment to the USB, which is our urban growth boundary, to bring Lusher Farm and other city-owned open spaces into our urban growth boundary or into our service area, which would necessitate amendments to the comprehensive plan and approval by Metro as well. Metro is really the lead on that. So that's it's a possibility that we may see something on that next year, as well as City Council possibly taking up the proposed overlay zone for the Tryon Creek wastewater treatment plant. It is pending the outcome of the feasibility study on the alternative design. So if that alternative design is a no-go, then it looks like we'll be going back to the proposal that the Planning Commission had recommended previously for the overlay. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the Planning Commission or questions? Next meeting, you're going to bring back some goals or send them in through email. Appreciate it. At this time, this Planning Commission meeting is adjourned.